how is Willie's hand?
Yay.
Thanks for asking. His hand is he's been going to um a hand therapy every other day, and his therapist is very, very, very pleased. What they're working on is the breaking down of the scar tissue so that he can have full mobility of his hand. So we're going camping this weekend, and I have seen because he's done a few things around the house. He's left-handed, and he injured his right hand, but he exhausts it pretty quickly. So that's just a work in progress. But he can discontinue his infusions. So
Yay.
he's got to do today and tomorrow, and then he's kind of excited about taking his PICC line out himself.
Well, he has it. Ooh.
Oh my God, it's the nurse in him. So yeah, he's doing well, and he and his therapist are very pleased with his progress on his hand. So yay, thanks for asking. Okay, let us take a look at this.
Another good map here.
Anybody have a spot to start? Because I got a spot I'd like to start.
Go ahead. I'm just
Well, one of the things that has become apparent to me in Peter Enns' writing specifically is how important the genealogies are, and how important sort of the list of names is, and I understand sort of the understanding that has started to deepen in me is that because I was a little flippant about things like the Vietnam Memorial Wall, where all the names are listed, or I mean, even I go with my son Tom every year to Fort Snelling to visit my parents' headstone, and just the sort of the overwhelmingness of all of those headstones with all of those names on there. And it's just becoming so clear how important that is. I don't know if I just needed to get old in order to. My son Tom clearly understands that. So he's much smarter than me, I think. And I think that that's what's developed for me in this is how important, not just for the historical. I mean, it's important for the historical marker, for that knowing where we've been, but I think it's becoming for me, how important it is even in the storytelling. I mean, you don't always have to have sort of excitement plot movement for the story, for that story to be told. So yeah. Amy, go ahead.
It's about who you are and how that affects how you live today.
Yeah.
And you see that in so many. Well, you saw it in the play last night, Sharon and Paula left.
I'm here. I'm just
okay. It affects how we see ourselves and how we see our family around us.
Yeah.
How we see our world around us.
And how we're so connected. And I think that has begun to, I mean, I've understood that, but it's only in these sort of genealogies over and over again. And the sort of the place that I'm finding myself, where I've come to realize not only for the past, but how it does indeed move us into a new reality. I need to introduce Bonnie, who just joined us. This is Bonnie Lahowski. She's
Bonnie.
She's at Trinity in Janesville.
Hi, Bonnie Lahowski.
She's in Janesville. and has kind of been in and out. Florida, isn't it? Florida,
Texas.
No, Texas.
Texas, where some of her family is. So she's been back and forth, and Bonnie wanted to just join us and kind of listen to the conversation and just kind of be a part of it. So,
She's
Thank
been
you.
listening to the book.
oh, good. That's good.
Yes,
Yes.
fascinating.
Is Peter Enns reading it?
Yes.
Oh, I might have to get it just to listen to him read to me.
That could be kind of interesting.
Yeah,
That'd
again,
be great.
like him so much. Well, I'm glad you're here, Bonnie.
Thank you.
So, yeah, what do you, anybody have anything to say about all of that? I mean, I also see that, the biblical story kind of leaves out people that seem to be unimportant in the action, but I guess that's the way that goes too.
I think that there's something here on 64 that I kind of had marked. Where he's talking about the confusion of languages is a play on words.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating?
The Hebrew word for confuse is Balal, which is a pun on Babylon. So that sort of says they were stupid, silly, arrogant Babylonians.
Mhm.
And I know next to nothing about that civilization. I mean, I only know what I read in Genesis. I only know what I read in the Bible. Does that sound Lutheran? I'll have to get into that more.
Yeah, that was pretty fascinating to
that was
read
there.
about that. Yeah.
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 The list of the chapters there. And what I like is that later on we realize how God brings it back through Jesus. He mentions that. I don't know if it's in this chapter or where I read it, but where the Babel starts and then he brings it back to the one. I think that's probably in one of the New Testaments, but I thought that was neat.
Let's back up just a couple of Peter Enns pages because
Good.
I have never, I mean, that whole Tower of Babel story is never really quite, I guess I've just not ever given it much thought, really.
And
And
yet, that's another one of those stories, like we talked about last week, being Sunday school staples.
yes, yeah.
And it's such a brief nothing almost.
Yeah.
It's like a throwaway.
It is. And then, so in the middle of page 63, that the paragraph that begins, but the writer is not trying to confuse, is trying to get the reader's attention. And putting these stories together like this is not an act of carelessness. He says, to see the point, we must remember once again that Genesis was put together by Israelites who had been captured by the Babylonians, as in the Tower of Babylonians. That's just completely gone over my head all this time. Isn't that something? Oh my. Yeah. So this post-flood group comes together to build a famous tower to reach into the heavens. It looked like a pyramid with stairs for sides and an altar on top. Since the gods were up there somewhere, building a stairway to heaven was an attempt to get in touch with the gods. By contrast, Israel's worship structures, the tabernacle and later the temple, didn't have steps going up to heaven. Instead, Israel waited for God to come down.
It was amazing. Yeah.
That's huge. That is, I mean, look at how what looks like, as Sharon described, this kind of sort of throwaway story. How that is repeated, traced, how it points us in the direction of the New Testament story, of the
Mhm.
Christ story, right? Because that story is about God coming into our midst, about God coming down, if you were. I mean, at every single, throughout the whole meta story, that's what it's about, is God coming into the midst of the people, and the people being most of the time incapable of seeing it, or just turning their backs on it.
God stoops.
God stoops,
Stoops.
and there it is, right there in the Tower of Babel story too. I mean, sort of the contrast of that in this story. I've never, for me, that's almost an earth-shattering um, understanding that God stoops, God's coming into it is so very different from sort of the wrath of God, is it not?
Oh, yeah.
The
Which
image
we
of
just,
going,
oops, sorry.
walking, oh, go ahead.
No,
You go.
No, you go.
Avis and then Sharon.
The image of God, of humans, walking upstairs to getting to God, it's an image of God isn't here and we have to take action to make it help. Whereas the image of waiting for God, it's about, it's very important in the Judeo-Christian tradition to say that God is already here, already among us, that, Abraham Heschel's book was it God in Search of Man,
Yeah, exactly. Sharon?
Well, I was just thinking of the contrast between this God coming down to be with the people, and what you said about the wrath of God, which we just had in the story of Noah.
Yeah. But I mean, does it not say something about, I mean, so I have trouble with violence, of course I do. But doesn't it say something about God's deepest desire to be with God's people? And that when, not if, but when God's people turn their backs on God, when God's people engage in idol worship, when God's people just outright forget who they are, God does something big in order to get their attention again. And I would put an unfortunately at the end of that because, as a parent, sometimes
You don't kill them off.
you don't kill them off, no, but sometimes you did have to do something big in order to get their attention. Either a big, huge thing or a big silent thing. I mean, something you had to do in order to get their attention.
Yep.
Again, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that I don't, that's just amazing. So the whole genealogy here goes until when? Yeah. We get to 12. Genesis 12, and we get to Abram. Yeah. And Abram and Sarai. Okay. So we got what, just 2 whole chapters of
12. Okay.
who's related to who?
Yep. I love the part here. It's kind of interesting in chapter 12, and I'm starting at the beginning. When it's written, there's so much left out, as you know.
So much left out of the biblical story?
Where it says, the Lord tells to Abram to go from this land I'll
Yeah.
bless those who know. And then the very next verse 4 says, so Abraham went, and I'm sitting there going,
Yeah.
what does that all mean? What does
What
that
happened in between there? Yeah, exactly.
what else was what did she you mean I have to pack up this whole big thing we've got and traipse where?
Yeah, exactly.
No,
Jane
again,
Forsberg.
it relies on the things seen and unseen.
Yeah.
I was struck by the that's so godlike kind of piece regarding Babel, regarding a people who had a common language, a common understanding, and a common problem, and how God separates them by giving them language that they don't understand each other well anymore, contrasting with the Holy Spirit at Pentecost
Where
coming to a group of people who did not understand, and God gave them understanding.
mhm.
So, so can we imagine the possibility that that Pentecost story and those people who were involved in that storytelling knew their scripture so well that indeed they had this Babel story in mind?
Maybe.
Can you go that far? Can you?
I can see it, yeah. Especially some of the ones who had spent more time studying scriptures.
You know, I mean, I don't know, but it just seems to me like, you know, the more I read Genesis and Revelation, the
Mhm.
more I realize how incredibly related they are.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. Even the response is, what is this? We see Parthians and Medes and
Medes
blah, blah,
and
blah, blah, blah.
Persians, and yeah.
yeah.
God
Yeah.
loved those Persians, those Iranians were back there then.
Well, and I mean, I would never suggest that it's like foreordained or and what I would go so far as to say is that the storytellers knew their scriptures well,
Oh, yeah.
and that on some level, indeed, they did make
Mhm.
that connection. Which again makes me sad that we don't know our scriptures at all.
Yeah, and that's why I enjoy this so much.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Avis.
So about the Pentecost in the New Testament, um, are you saying that it's like a fictional story with symbolic meaning, but that they did not in fact have this event,
Oh,
so many
no,
days after the
no,
resurrection?
no.
That it wasn't like a real event? I always thought it was a real event, but
No, no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that at all.
okay.
What I am saying is that as the story around the event, I mean, as that whole thing happened, people were well aware.
Yeah.
They remembered.
Okay.
They remembered. They remembered what had happened in that older. That's all I'm saying. No, I'm not
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
not suggesting that.
Right. Because these would have been devout people who were at the temple,
Which it says.
which
There were
they
devout
certainly
people on
have
both sides, yeah.
history that they understood and could see a resemblance.
Mhm.
Yeah, and resemblance might be as strong a word as you could use. I don't know. But it sure resembles to me that Tower of Babel story. Yeah. 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 Who knows?
There's an interesting contrast. The Tower of Babel story was about people not being able to connect with each other, disconnection, not understanding, whereas the Pentecost story
Yes,
is
exactly.
about the opposite. It's about a deeper level of connection with God and each other.
Each other.
Yeah.
Did Matthew Skinner say anything about that in his Acts book? Did
Maybe.
he make that connection at all? I'm trying to remember that now. I might have to pick up and take a look at that again and see if we've read that somewhere. Because are we smart enough to come up with that ourselves?
Well, maybe.
Maybe we read that somewhere. I don't know. Okay. What do we think now? Moving into Abraham. Abraham.
I like this part where he says at the bottom of 65, the preliminaries are over. He took 11 chapters to prepare them, and now he's right. And we have this wonderful map, which I appreciate so much because I try to put it side by side with what I'm sort of familiar with.
Yeah.
With the Fertile Crescent there, and I appreciate that detail about and again, the detail of struggle between God and Israel as God tries to move Israel toward their calling to be God's people.
Yeah. And how
some of the print in here is way too small.
Yeah, I had to get my phone out to make it bigger. And what the biblical text, I think this is another thing that people who aren't reading this don't maybe quite understand is, and I can't say that I understand it completely either, but that sort of the main characters in this sacred story are so incredibly flawed. The modern day criticism of the church, modern, I use that word sort of expansively the last, century, that, the reason I don't go to church is because those people who go to church are so hypocritical, right? They are, they go and they pretend that they're somebody that they're not. Or you have to be perfect in order to go to church. I mean, there's all sorts of similar sort of criticisms around this common theme that completely misunderstands a faith journey and a life of worship in community, that we bring our terribly flawed and broken selves to the altar to be healed, right? And that I think that's what the biblical story shows us is these terribly flawed and broken people. And that God, again, stoops into those lives for healing and into the life of God's people, not just in the individual lives, but into the life of God's people. And we turn our backs again and again and again. And Israel turns its back again and again and again. And God is relentless. I mean, that's what, Avis, you just referred to in that book. And what's that other, The Hounds of Heaven? What's that one?
You just read my mind. A priest we had can't use that in this sermon. And so one thing as a child, I never forgot where he quoted The Hounds of Heaven, God relentlessly coming after his people.
Yeah.
I don't know, was that T.S. Lewis?
No, I don't know.
T.S. Eliot?
T.S. Eliot? No, I don't think so. Don't remember who that is. Yeah. I mean, and it's pretty darn clear in this story. That's
I wonder what it took, and this is me just wondering, thinking of the spaces between the stories, the paragraphs, which are spaces of time, what it took for Abram to decide, yes, he was going to go ahead and go. You've got this.
Why to go from his?
Okay, so I'm in chapter.
Yeah.
I'm in chapter 12.
Yeah.
God says, I will make you a great nation and bless you. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and etc. It says, so Abram went. So
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting to think about getting into the mind of
Yeah.
what that meant to Abram and what
Right.
was the circumstances of him leaving what was I am led to believe a rather prosperous life.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Why would he do that? I mean, I guess I could understand a little more about Moses. He's kind of trying to
Yeah.
escape a little, right?
Well, he had troubles.
Yeah, he had troubles. I mean, so on page 65 of our Genesis book, we have that big paragraph that at the end says, after all, the line of Terah is about Abraham, the central character in Genesis, and along with Moses and King David, one of the three central characters in the entire Old Testament. So as we look at these central characters, Abraham, Moses, and David, you know, what is I think that is a legitimate question to ask. You know, why? Why do they respond? Why do they respond to this God when again, they had all sorts of choices, right? All sorts of gods and all sorts of choices, and yet they respond to this God, and in their brokenness and imperfection, I don't know what the word I want is right there. They do what God asks of them.
Well, that's the implication that you get.
Yeah.
A straight biblical story.
Yeah. Not necessarily happily, but
Compelled.
Pardon, Jane?
Compelled.
Compelled.
Almost to act beyond your intention.
Mm-hmm.
They had a kind of a goofy story on public television last night about a guy who he golfed continuously. And my thought was, I mean, his goal was like to do 18,000 holes in a year. He would golf unless there was snow on the ground. And all you can think of is,
why?
Why? Yeah, why? What makes you want to do that you would set aside everything else to achieve that?
Yeah.
And could not that be the same sort of compulsion that Abraham feels, I have to follow this God?
Yeah, let's pursue that question a little bit more, because I mean it's the same question I often ask about Jesus. What is who in their right mind would drop everything and follow Jesus? And we do have the story, those fisher people who probably, weren't making a heck of a lot of money, but they dropped their families.
Yeah.
In order to follow Jesus. Matthew might have had a little bit more, but he might have had a rather lucrative position as the tax collector. So that's the way the story gets told, is that they dropped everything to follow Jesus. Well, Abram did the same thing. He dropped everything.
I have a question there, though. I got a feeling that Abram took a lot of his property with him as his movable animals, because later on it talks about that. But yeah, Peter talks about that, where he says, Lord, we have given up everything to follow you.
And didn't follow.
And then there's that question mark in his mind, and what is this going to get us?
So yeah, I think it's a legitimate question to ask. And I know that there have been theologians who have written over time about the nature of service, the nature of giving, the nature of charity, and that charity isn't really charity unless you get nothing out of it. And as far as I'm concerned, that's an impossibility, because you never get nothing out of it, right?
You get the joy of sharing those. Well,
Exactly. So it's a legitimate question to ask, what do they get out of it?
at
But
the end,
I don't know.
go ahead, Kathy.
That's not, but I don't think that's the driving question.
No, it's not. That's not what they're, that's why I said there's this paragraph blank, so
Yeah.
Abram went, and I'm thinking,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay, what did that all, besides just taking wife, children, and stuff, or wife and lambs, and it sounds like he had quite a fairly prosperous farm, taking with him, what was it?
So
We'll never know.
it can't be a story just about, I'm saying this, I don't know if I believe this or not. It can't be a story just about God. It has to be a story also about the people of God. Go ahead, Avis.
Well, this is not a very spiritual answer, but my husband Dave and I visited Turkey, and we went down to Haran, which is actually just a few miles from the border with Syria. And we had a local guy kind of like take us around, and there's some very fertile land in that area. So Abraham might have, I mean, if he was a guy with money, he might have been in search of cropland or better land for his livestock, or adventure or riches. And I'm thinking about the American story of Go West, Young Man.
Yeah.
That it's, then if you got plenty of money, then you can afford to take some chances. If you're living, day to day, then your risk tolerance is very low and you don't go anywhere. But more affluent people,
Which you get the
in our
feeling
time
Abram
buy
was-
jets, huh?
Abram was fairly affluent.
It
Did-
seems-
Yeah.
It seems that he was.
Did you get that in there?
But then then they suffer this famine. They went in 1210. There was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt.
So they go to Egypt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you
That
are.
seems to be a recurring theme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, "I know well that you're." That is such a confusing story.
Yes.
It is. It's
Yeah.
like, what? Why would they behave? Why would they treat her better as his sister than as his? I don't.
Because
They wouldn't
Abraham
treat her better. They'd
No,
treat
Abraham
him
could get
worse.
something out of it. I mean, that talk about a transaction, right?
Right. Yeah.
Abraham sure benefited out of that one.
Mhm.
Uh,
Well,
Why is he
I always
different,
assumed
though?
that he was afraid they'd kill him.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it
You
says.
betcha.
yeah,
So they could take her as wife. So that assumes that the Egyptians had some sense of not just taking another woman, whether the husband was around or not, or whatever.
Yeah, maybe a little more than Abram himself.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah, that's a confusing thing to me. And then the fact that in the end, the Egyptian pharaoh, whatever was king at the time, doesn't do anything to him. He just says, "Get out of here. I don't want." Again, the transactionalism. I don't want all bad stuff happening to me. So you have that primitive concept of good and right and wrong.
And the whole, I mean, Pharaoh got rid of them because plagues were happening to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Egyptians.
yeah. Let's revisit on in our book on page 65, right there in the middle. See if this helps us at all. The pressing question here is whether Abraham, this new Adam, will work out. And he does, though not without moments that cause readers to panic and then culminating in a truly unexpected development. Enter Abraham, whose story is introduced at the end of the descendants of Shem in chapter 11, verses 10 through 26, in the 5th section in Genesis. And then we move to the 6th section, 11:27, with the descendants of Terah, Abraham's father. It seems like the writer's burning up his allotted 10 sections pretty early, 6 down, and we're not even out of chapter 11. But with this 6th section will take a while. We won't see another one until chapter 25. After all, the line of Terah is about Abraham, and then the central character in Genesis. So I mean, sometimes I want, again, I have to remind myself that the interconnectedness of the people is very, very important. And at the same time, I think, can't we just get on with the story? But is this all setting us up for the biblical chapter 15, God's covenant with Abraham?
Maybe.
Is all of this helping us to get to that place of, the question continues to be, what is so compelling? And how are these people experiencing this God who comes to them as a very different kind of God in a social world in which people are constantly seeking that stairway to heaven? So is that the difference between
Oh, it's the personal. The stairway to heaven is you're going up and you're experiencing this creature that's way up here that has nothing to do with, whereas the God of Abraham, I call him the God of Abraham,
Yeah.
is coming saying,
Right here.
I'm talking to you personally.
Yeah.
You matter to me. We
Yeah,
have
yeah.
a relationship.
Well, and so that's, I think so is it the difference between having all those figures on your altar and worshiping all of these other gods? I mean, as that stairway, as different from this God who comes here. Sharon, you're going to jump in.
Well, one thing that the genealogies prompted me to think, there are so many. Why Abraham?
Yeah.
What was so special about him?
That's a good question too. Did God just pick Abraham out of the ether? That's a great question. Why Abraham? He's just an ordinary Joe.
Why not Lot's father, Abraham's brother?
Mhm.
Terah?
No, Terah was his father.
Terah's Abraham, yeah.
Hanan, or no, Paran. Is that it? Maybe not.
Why not one of those other guys?
Yeah.
Why?
Was Abraham a historical figure? Or is he part of the origins, the mythological origin story of the Israelites?
Is there something, and I haven't read it in a while, that talks about a real person, a person. What does the word Abram or Abraham mean? And I forgot that too, name-wise. That would give us a clue.
I don't know. I don't think ends.
I'll look it up.
Yeah,
Does
look
it
at
have
it.
something to do with a wandering Aramean?
I got something here in the Bible where and I'm using the new interpreters that Sharon told me about.
It says father of a multitude.
Yeah, where it says,
Was that Abram or Abraham, or are they the same thing? Because what
the
is
same
the
thing.
change?
Change his name.
What is the change?
Okay, it says Abraham's original name was Abram, meaning exalted father, and
Okay.
God changed it to Abraham to signify his future role as the ancestor of many nations.
Right. It says here, Abram's move to a new land was considered by the early Christians to be the act of great faith. The narratives are and I may not pronounce this right, are primarily from the Yahwist, which occasionally priestly supplements.
Yeah. Yeah. And be that as it may be, that Christian understanding of that, it still does not answer the question.
No.
I mean, as early Christians look back on that and say, "Oh, wasn't Abraham a faithful person?" It still doesn't answer the question. What was so compelling to have Abram pick up his family and go? I mean, is the only answer to that question God is a God who continues to I mean, is God the kind of God you can't say no to? I mean, I don't think that's true. I mean, I think there's stories throughout this biblical history where the characters have said no to God. And I personally believe there were a lot of women that said no to God before Mary said yes. I mean, heck. Now that'd be a hard yes, right?
And when and off on a tangent, because I tend to get, I think about, well, as I was watching the play last night, I was thinking, how did Mary deal with Jesus, a perfect teenager? How did she deal with the rest of them? Or did Mary have to go and help fix supper for a group at the synagogue? Well, they didn't have a synagogue back then, I guess, did they? Did she have to go and help some of the? She ever go and help some of the other ladies with things? There's so much.
Well, and remember, when Jesus was a teenager, remember when she gave birth, she was just a kid. So,
So she was still.
Yeah, Jane.
Also thinking that Abram had a backup plan because he tells God, I don't have a son.
Oh yeah.
How will I be a father of a great many people? I don't have a son. As a matter of fact, he names whatever the fella is going to inherit when I die. He'll get my estate.
Uh-huh.
A servant of.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's sort of like Abraham is hearing from God over this. So he's elderly by our standards, certainly. And he's hearing from God over a period of time, but still he's got a plan B in mind.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when God breaks into that.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, even when he gives Hagar.
Right. I mean, even that story, which is an absolutely horrible story.
Yes.
Yeah.
That isn't that something that it is so important for him, as far as he's concerned, to have an heir, that he's willing to do that.
You ever think what it would have been like if Hagar had a girl? Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But God goes along and says, no, this isn't, there's gonna be another one.
Yeah. God hangs on to him. I mean, there's so many places where God could have said, I'll go find somebody else for him.
Yeah. Somebody else has got to be better at this than you, Abram.
Yeah. Especially when he goes down into Egypt and has all this stuff.
Yeah. No, I mean, what does that do for us? What does that story? I mean, I think of David, the story of David and how horrible he was. And
Well, even Solomon, what he does.
Yeah. Yeah. These are can be truly,
None of the kings were
yeah,
yeah,
horrible,
any good. Yeah.
horrible.
I mean, Saul was certainly no peach.
That's why Daniel is named Daniel and not David. That's silly or not. That's our son. I looked at them. I'm in labor, and I said to Bruce, we probably should think of a name for a boy, because of course I had a girl's name picked out. And I went, no, 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 don't want David. Don't like that story. We'll go on with Daniel. But yeah, he was a piece of it.
No, no.
God tends to pick us pieces of it, doesn't he? Doesn't God?
I mean, is that part? I mean, is that the continuous thread that God keeps at us horribly broken? And and that's part of the original story. The horrible brokenness of humanity. And the gift that God gives in that God doesn't make the decisions on our behalf, that God leaves those decisions up to us, and we make really, really poor ones. And God keeps with us. I mean, for me, that is compelling. That's what's compelling, is that no matter what terrible decisions I can make, God doesn't leave me bereft. God picks me up out of the gutter and we go again.
Amen.
Yeah. And I do see how hard that is to believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
I understand why people can't believe in a God who is so personal and so intimate in those ways.
And to do that, you have to believe in the fact of brokenness and that yourself is not perfect to begin with. And that's why I'm thinking of one of my beloved cousins who I don't think is, maybe admits it, but doesn't see the relationship with that and God. And it's hard for some of us, who have always lived for a sort of Christian life and, made not a bazillion terrible things, and say, okay, yeah, that's me too.
Yeah, that's me too. Yeah.
That's me too.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Avis.
Keep making these unspiritual comments. I'm kind of sleepy this morning, but I wonder if some of this is part of monotheism. Other cultures had, pantheons, and and their leaders came to be treated like deities, like, the Egyptian leaders styled themselves as leaders, and then this group, worship Yahweh and Yahweh alone, and were very opposed to having any other idols. And so I'm just thinking, like in 2025, we have a modern day Goliath in the White House. And, we're just so wishing for that leader who can lead us out of this mess. But then we shouldn't idolize that leader too much. Shouldn't think they're perfect.
Yeah. Well, and don't we do that at every single time? The priest you're going to call to your church needs to be the salvation of that church. That priest is, you want Jesus.
Doesn't happen.
And the
But
reality
you probably wouldn't like Jesus either.
exactly. Yeah. I'm so far from Jesus, right? But you wouldn't want Jesus either. I mean, because
And it's hard because I think that's a problem that isn't brought up, that maybe needs to be said blatantly.
yeah.
I'm not, and to say, okay, we accept that about, and in that acceptance, that's where the relationship begins.
Begins exactly. And that's what leadership looks like, Anne, right there. Go ahead, Sharon.
On the other hand, the church sets you up.
It does.
Yes.
You're right there.
I love you dearly, but you're my friend Kathy.
Same.
Um, TJ is almost young enough to be my grandson. I'm
Been
not
my
calling
son,
him
I know.
father.
Yeah, yeah.
Different feeling.
Um,
Yeah.
and that whole thing is a setup to think that your priest is more than what they are, your
Yeah.
pastor.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
I could
and your priest is your priest ordained in that brokenness, in that humanity, in that uh in the midst of redemption as well.
So folks, I assume we are not meeting next week since it's the 4th of July.
I have no reason not to meet.
I will be at the parade in Milton. We
Okay,
have an open house for
great.
Christopher.
10 o'clock parade. Is that a 10 o'clock parade?
No, it's at 1 o'clock. Oh, that's our.
What's your open house for Christopher?
He and Aurora built a house.
Oh yeah. So
They bought
they're
a
in
house.
people to their house. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's not till 5:30, and then we wouldn't have to leave till 11. Yeah, I'm fine with next week at this
I-
time.
I'm fine with next week too.
Up to you guys.
Works for me.
Okay, well, let's look at chapter 8, Genesis 12 through 22. Abraham is chosen. This should be
Yeah,
fun.
it's a long one.
Yeah.
We'll take our time with that.
Yeah.
12
Abraham, an unlikely hero. I did start reading into this chapter, and one of the things I believe is true in the story is that it shows forth the pattern of God's creation, God's blessing humanity, individuals and humanity turning away from God, and etc. And I think that starts to become clear as we read this. So see if you can identify that sort of pattern in what you're reading.
Okay.
Guys?
All right.
We'll see ya.
See you next
Well,
week.
okay,
Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I'm getting there.